This episode is brought to you by Scripture Notes. This is the tool that I use every day for my own personal scripture study. I want to show you yet another feature that is really cool about Scripture Notes. If you look at this center column here, this is 1 Corinthians, what we're studying for Come Follow Me this week. And I go to verse 12 in chapter 1, and I click on this link. I get a number of different tools that I can use. I can go directly to Bible Hub. This is something that I use all the time. I can go to the Blue Letter Bible, another great study resource for the Bible. I can go to the LDS Citation Index. This is fabulous. And here are a number of resources from talks in General Conference. Here's Mark E. Peterson in 1976 referring to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 12. And then, of course, lastly, I can also go to the Joseph Smith translation and see if there's anything different that I might find in that translation. Again, it's the fluidity of Scripture Notes that is so great to me. I can go to any of these links here for additional resources on any verse or any chapter. Try out Scripture Notes at scripturenotes.com. That's scripturenotes.com. Here we go. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have brought back Jennifer Roach to talk about abuse in the church. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
There is a narrative out there, especially from critics of the church, that the church is, that sexual abuse is running rampant in the church, that we're worse than all the other churches. You gave a presentation at Fair just a couple of weeks ago with some amazing research. Is the church that bad? Are we really in a position that the critics state that we are with abuse in the church?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's the greatest question, right? This question has vexed researchers for forever because there isn't really a great source to go to say this group it's happening this way, and this group it's happening this way. And the last 6 months have done some research on a data set that actually, as far as I know, it's the first research that is answering the question of what are the rates of abuse in different churches. It's not perfect. There's issues where I wish this data was better than it is, and I would love to find another data set to confirm this research with. But I think you're going to be pretty fascinated by what I found. So you're familiar with the Boy Scouts, obviously.
Eagle Scout here, by the way.
Oh, golly, yeah. There you go.
Oh, but by tyranny, not by my choice.
Thanks, Mom. Depending upon the decade, LDS troops made up roughly 30% of the entire population of Boy Scout troops. And it varies a tiny little bit, but basically that's what it is. I don't know. I have looked and tried to find what percent did other denominations make up. That information isn't really available. That's one piece that I wish I had. But we have what we have to work with, and it's pretty good because so there's a collection of data that the Boy Scouts call the ineligible volunteer files, which basically what that is they have kept files for 80 years on people that should not be around children. The kind of nickname for these files is the perversion files, or the P files is what most people call them. There's over 5,000 files in this database. You can go online and look at it. The LA Times owns the database right now. You can search by your town. You can search by an abuser's name. You can search by a troop number and just kind of see, like, gosh, what are in these files? I went through and did some statistical analysis on them and found it's about 5% of the files that had to be eliminated. And the reasons why those were eliminated from my set is some of them are non-abuse perversions, or what they would have called perversions back in the day. Like there's a file on a man in the 1950s who was having a consensual homosexual relationship with another man who was not involved in the Boy Scouts whatsoever. However, at that time, that would disqualify you from serving in the Boy Scouts. So that guy's in the P files. So files like that are eliminated. There are some files where it is impossible to tell what this troop was, who had sponsored them, like it just wasn't useful data. So all of those were eliminated. But it leaves us with 95% of the files. And in that 95%, the vast majority are troops that are sponsored by churches, Methodist, LDS, all kinds of different things. About 2 or just a little bit over 1% of the files or of the troops are sponsored by like civic groups, service clubs, stuff like that. So those are also eliminated from my data. So we end up with this really large cache of information. Even though these files are 80 years old, some of them, every one of them has a cover sheet. And on the cover sheet, it asks, what is the religion of the man himself? What is the church affiliation of this group? Occasionally, that's blank, but you can read the file and figure it out pretty fast, right? It's very obvious. This was a Catholic troop. This was whatever. So went through, kind of just tallied up what abuse is happening where. Now, the interesting part about the 30% is you would expect there to be a fair or equal distribution among roughly all the churches that are involved. The Catholic Church situation is kind of an outlier here, but Catholic churches did not sponsor that many LDS troops. So their number actually comes out a little lower than kind of people in the popular imagination might think. So you might expect 30% roughly of those abusers to be in LDS affiliated troops. And it turns out it's not even close. It's just over 5%, which like that's a shocking number. It's 75% lower than what you would expect statistically. Now, no amount of abuse is good. And when I say expect, don't hear that as we expect abuse to happen.
No, it's expectations of the data.
Yes. So the question becomes, why? Why is our number so low? The thing I didn't address in my talk, I just didn't want to spend the time on it. But the cynical answer to that question is, well, our church is better at hiding it. We suppress this information. Families are pressured into not destroying the reputation of the church, and so they don't report. And that's a fair question. Is that
Sure,
what
absolutely.
is happening?
People
However,
are very committed to the church,
mhm,
and they don't want to, give the church a black eye. And
yeah,
that's and it's a natural place for someone criticizing what you're saying to go to. That would be the next step.
absolutely. The LDS centric bias or anti-LDS centric bias in that is a lack of understanding that, families in a Methodist church feel the same way about their church. Catholic families feel the same way about their church. And like everyone feels that way about there are no devoted members of a church anywhere who say, oh yeah, I really want my church to have a black eye. That's not a thing. Everyone feels this pressure to roughly the same degree. Our church is not different than any other church in that. So I just push that criticism aside. The question of why is this happening? There are about a dozen agreed upon kind of best practices for preventing child abuse. I can go through them quickly if you want, but the short story there is every single one of those is already addressed in our handbook, already addressed in like the youth and child protection training. The same standards that everyone else is doing, we're already doing. But it's weird, right? Because why would we have this 5% number if we're doing what everybody else is doing? Like, why is ours so much lower? And I have some theories. I can't prove my theories, but I think they're pretty good. You want to go into that part?
Yes. Let's speculate a little bit.
Yeah, I love it. Let me scroll down to my.
And by the way, Jennifer, I think you do have a little bit of a unique, apart from doing this research, you have a little bit of a unique perspective because you're a convert to the church.
I am.
So you come in with fresh eyes several years ago to see, okay,
Mhm.
what am I seeing here? What am I recognizing here?
Yeah. And this is where, for me, the conversation with lifelong members is so fascinating on these issues, because some of the things I'm about to name, most people do not think of as child protections. And to be honest, they weren't set up that way to be child protections. They were just how the church was set up. And it turns out they also protect children. If you've been in the church forever, you're a fish in water and can't describe water, right? You're totally blind to these in some ways. The first one I want to talk about is the way that we call volunteers. Let me illustrate that by saying how it happens in most other church, at least Protestant churches. You could show up on your first day at a Protestant or evangelical church and express interest in getting involved, volunteering with the kids, doing all the things. Now, that church probably has a process that you're going to need to go through. They're going to do some screening. They're going to interview you. They might require you to join like the membership of that church. They're going to have some stuff for you to do. Some churches have a wait period on top of that. The longest one that I know of is 6 months. But the reality is you could walk in the front door of a church and be placed in responsibility over children 6 months later. In our church, if the intention in your heart was to mess with kids, you have to sit around and wait to see, are you going to get a calling with children or not? And you might get called as ward librarian, and then you got to ride out that calling for 2 years. And then you get calling as the historian of the, right? Like you might wait a real long time. If you have joined that church with the idea in mind of getting access to kids, you're going to have some patience. And that is not likely to be what happens. Now, I know, I absolutely know that the poor exhausted bishop somewhere has somebody come up to him and say, hey, like I got energy, like I'd love to help out in primary. A bishop is going to be super tempted to issue a calling on the spot, right? Like I get it. However, when the calling system is followed in the way that it should be, that is a child protection that other churches just don't have.
Mm-hmm.
Related to that one, this one makes me laugh because no one thinks of this as child protection, but it's that people get sustained in sacrament meeting. I don't mean it in the ritual religious sense that somehow is endowing them with great ethics towards children. What I mean is, again, it just as a contrast, in a Protestant church, you could volunteer to work with the children, go through their whole process, wait the 6 months, be given a role of responsibility over children, and the 800 other people in your church have no idea, unless they happen to be a parent of one of the kids you're over, they have no idea that you're doing this. So what that means is somebody sitting on the other side of the room, if they know some information about you having been kind of questionable with kids in the past, or that they just have some feelings about like, wait a minute, this guy, like somebody needs to know about this. Brother so-and-so is going to get sustained in sacrament meeting, and everybody is going to know he now has a primary calling. And maybe the average member does not feel comfortable raising their hand against the sustaining in public, but they certainly could go talk to their bishop. Whereas in other churches, they don't even have the opportunity to do that. And quite frankly, there isn't a mechanism for people objecting to callings.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be like, well, they went through our training, we screened them, they're fine, stop your complaining. So no one thinks about the sustaining happening at sacrament meeting as a child protection, but it is. Related to that one, your ward boundaries are a child protection. No one thinks of that. However, here's how it goes in other places. If you have a desire to harm children in your heart and you get involved in your neighborhood church and somebody's on to you, maybe you've done something, maybe you haven't even done anything, but people are treating you with suspicion around kids, all you have to do is leave that church and drive across town to another one where nobody knows you. And there is no calling and checking up on those people. That doesn't happen. You could drive as far away as you want to. You could go to as many churches as you wanted to. And every time that potential abuser runs into a roadblock or he does something that raises suspicion in other people, he's learning. He's learning what not to do, how to not raise suspicion. And he gets an unlimited number of tries because there's an unlimited number of churches for him to go try.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a very interesting thought.
So in our church, you are expected, with very few exceptions, to attend church with your neighbors. And yes, you could move. We'll get to how that gets addressed in a minute.
But it's but obviously it's an obstacle. I mean, it's you're starting to try to move mountains now to try to get things done.
Absolutely. And maybe some people would do that, but it's way easier to just go join another church, right? So the existing, so your ward boundaries mean the people inside your ward or your stake are known by each other. And reputation is a real thing. And if you have a reputation for not being safe around kids, that's going to be an obstacle for you for sure. Let me address the part of like, well, that dude could just get up and move. He could move to another stake. Some members, I think, don't even know that this happens, but the local leadership in your ward or your branch, they can make an annotation on your member number, and that member number follows you everywhere. So if you move from Utah to Kansas, your local bishop's going to pull up your number and be like, oh, no youth callings for this person, right? Let me give you the most poignant contrast that I know of. The Southern Baptist Convention, they have had their share of abuse problems. And about 10 years ago, a group of advocates was trying to get them to create essentially a member number system. And at first they actually agreed and said, that's actually a great idea. And then they came back and said, you know what? We've got 14 million members. There's no way we could keep track of numbers for that many members, which of course makes every LDS person giggle, right? Somehow we're doing that. But here's what the Southern Baptists did do, is they said, we actually could keep track of who these guys are. And so they did. They started a database of keeping track of who the abusers were. However, that database only existed for their top leadership at their headquarters. They knew
only in the convention, only the members of the convention,
only the very, very top tier of leadership of their denomination had access to this database, meaning they knew who these guys were and where they were working and what churches they were in, and they didn't warn anybody. So yeah, like, okay, you couldn't make a member number system, but you made a member number system for the abusers and tracked them and where they were going, but you didn't warn parents, right? So the fact that this is just a regular thing that most people never even think about, it's a pretty good protection. Now, I know it doesn't always work. I know people have not always annotated. I know there are bishops who haven't always read what is annotated. However, when people do what they're supposed to do, follow the procedures that are already in place, that's a great child protection that nobody else is doing. So the next protection that I think people don't necessarily recognize in our church, it really only applies to teenage girls and children, not as much to teenage boys. Teenage girls are abused at a higher rate than teenage boys are. However, abuse generally comes from men on both sides. It's men abusing boys and it's men abusing girls.
Yes.
The example that just popped in everyone's mind of, whatever school teacher who, she abuses her student. Yes, it happens. it's extremely statistically rare, which is why those examples stick in people's mind. The vast majority of abuses comes from men. I don't say that to bash men by any means. That's just what's in the data.
It is what it is.
It is what it is, right? So in our church, the young women have their own adult women leaders who are called and sustained to oversee the spiritual lives of these girls. They have authority under the direction of the bishop, but they have authority over these girls and the ability to help lead and guide them. That doesn't mean the girls are never taught by a man, right? Like a man might teach their combined Sunday school,
Sure.
whatever. But they still have 3 or more adult women who are keeping eyes on them. In other places, they call, young women and young men are usually one combined thing, and they call it a youth ministry. Most of the time that's overseen by men, very often young men in their 20s, guys who are perhaps headed toward becoming pastors or they have interest in that. So they're not too much older than the girls. They're not super well trained, and they are in charge.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there might be women volunteers around, but those women don't have any authority. It's mostly a male-run domain. And in our church, they are assigned grown adult women to keep eyes on them, which is a wonderful benefit for the young women in our church. Doesn't really help out the young men, right? Like that's a different issue. But it's women in primary and it's women in young women's. It's just a safer scenario than it is with men.
Sure.
I mean, I hate to say that I like men quite a lot. I just not bashing here. My next one, disfellowshipping. In other churches, even if you're convicted of committing abuse against a child, you're not necessarily kicked out. In our church, you will get kicked out. Now, I know historically that hasn't happened every single time, but if you want to follow the rule book, that's what it says: is people who abuse children are disfellowshipped, and they require First Presidency approval to get rebaptized. That is not a thing anywhere else. Part of my background I didn't mention at the beginning of this is, I grew up outside of the LDS Church, in a church where one pastor after another was abusing teenagers, including me. And some of those pastors are still working in churches where the churches know full well exactly what they did, and they don't care. It is not a disqualifying
These are pastors
event.
that have had legal issues with this as well?
Yes. So this is where, let me talk a little bit about background checks here and how this gets complicated. A person who has committed abuse, the most likely outcome by far is that they get away with it. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is, we call it the delayed disclosure problem, which is victims don't want to talk about it. It's incredibly shameful, especially children don't want to talk about it. There's research that says there's a certain percentage of children, about 30%, where even if video or photographic evidence exists of them being abused, they will deny it because they're so afraid and ashamed, and they think they're going to get in trouble. And they will be shown a picture and say, nope, that's not me. That didn't happen to me, right? So victims have this notorious problem of delaying reporting. In fact, the average age of someone ever reporting abuse for the first time to anyone is 52. So they're
not even telling anybody at all until they're 52 years old.
That's the average.
Who are they telling? Do we know? Is it a spouse usually, or
it depends. It could be spouse, It could be their friends, it could be their therapist, it could be lots of different people.
Sure.
What happens is in childhood, less than 20 5%. I can't remember the exact number. This is the research of a group called Child USA. They kind of own this area of research. In childhood, abuse is much more likely to be detected than disclosed, meaning some adult figures out, wait a minute, there's something going on here. Kids don't be like, well, can I have a moment of your time to tell you what my uncle is doing to me, right? Like, it's not how kids think. So we say in childhood, it's detected. In someone's 20s and 30s, less than 10% of people, they're talking about their abuse. So it's almost never disclosed in your 20s and 30s. It rises a little bit in your 40s. The most likely age that someone is ever going to talk about their abuse is between 50 and 70. So if you're a 50-year-old and you were abused at age 5 or age 15, the legal statute of limitations for a criminal charge has long run out, even in the most generous of states.
Did you mention the percentage? Do we have a percentage of that then, of what is disclosed? Do we know that?
Of abuse.
I mean, obviously you can't ever know that because so much of it is not disclosed. Yeah. But do we have like any kind of an estimate on that?
I don't know. I mean, there are people who try with estimates and it's all over the board.
But
I wouldn't.
It sounds like it's minute.
Yeah, it is, which is why I say the most likely outcome of abuse is nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
So if the criminal statute of limitations has run out and a victim decides to disclose, nothing will ever happen as far as criminal charges. So these pastors from the church where I grew up easily pass a background check, and their churches probably did background check them. There's nothing to find because there's no available criminal charge because the statute of limitations has run out. Their victim did not report in time. I did not report in time. Right? So background checks are actually, they're really problematic in a lot of ways because we think that someone passing a background check means that they're safe. And that carries weight with parents. If your bishop gets up and says, we'd like to extend a calling to Brother Jones, he has a clean background check. Every parent in that ward is going to go, all right, he's a good guy. Trust my kid with him. And they let down their guard just enough. And that's a problem. Now, background checks are going to continue to become more and more required. That is just where we're going. You've seen the news story out of the UK where the church in the UK is now requiring background checks.
Well, really almost everybody on that, Jennifer, is saying, okay, well, great. This is great. I mean, why isn't the church doing this in the first place everywhere?
Yeah. I can't, so I'll speak for the church. How they would articulate their reason for not doing it might be different than how I'm articulating it. However, the reason not to do background checks is this sort of false sense of security of Brother Jones passed his background check. He's safe with kids. Let me give you the example. I mean, if anybody cares about this topic, they know about this case, and it's the Bisbee, Arizona case. The AP wrote a huge article about it last year. If people know my name from anywhere, it's because I went on and on and on about that article on literally every podcast that would have me, right? Including yours, maybe. I can't remember. The Bisbee, Arizona case involves a LDS family. The father is nominally involved in the church. Just he goes a couple times a year. He's not endowed. He has the Aaronic priesthood. That's it. He is one of the most horrific abusers I have ever heard of in my life. And I spend my life in the sewers of talking about abuse. But the guy also worked for Border Patrol. And so here's what that means is he had to pass a federal level background check every single year. And he does. His background check is clean. And he's literally making pornography of his own children and putting it on the internet. Right? So this man did not have a primary calling. He never had a calling with children. However, imagine this scenario where he gets a primary calling. If background checks are required, Bishop gets up and says, Brother Adams passed his background check, you guys. He's safe to work with kids. And he's literally the most notorious abuser that I know of. That man could pass a background check until the day he hung himself in jail. There's nothing to find on his background because he had not been convicted.
It's a false positive. I mean, it lulls people into a sense of security that he has to have passed all these things in his work. Therefore, he's safe, and perhaps makes those that would be around him a little less sensitive, especially even a bishop, right? A little less sensitive to the fact that, hey, there might be something going on here.
Yes, exactly. And all abusers need is for parents to lower their guard just a tiny bit.
Now,
no, go ahead.
No, in that case, I was going to move on to, in that case, there was also in that AP article, as I recall, there was they were taking the calling system of the church into account and stating how really the framework of it was that the calling system of the church, where the bishop would call essentially the attorneys of the church.
Yeah, you're talking about the helpline.
And that was that was positioned in the article and with critics of the church as, look, this is just to save the church. This is to make sure the church doesn't look bad and really doesn't have any consideration for the alleged victim.
Yeah.
Can you address that a little bit more? What?
Yeah. To this day, you can go online and find people saying the helpline only exists to get the church out of legal trouble. To which I say, absolutely, that is part of why it exists. Do you know how to keep the church out of legal trouble? Follow the law. And that's what the helpline is there in part for them to do. A bishop learns about abuse in his church. It is not as straightforward as people think. Can I give you my favorite example of this?
Please. Yeah.
So in the state of Utah today, on the books, you could find that the age of consent in Utah is 18. So imagine that you're a bishop, and in the normal course of your bishop duties, you learn about two scenarios. One is 2 13-year-old kids in your ward have engaged in some heavy making out and done some sexual touching with each other, right? Chances are you're going to address that as a law of chastity issue. You're going to, get some accountability for these, like whatever. You're going to address that as a spiritual issue. But you also learn about a situation of a 16-year-old in a full-blown sexual relationship with a 22-year-old. Now, if you're a normal person, a non-attorney, you probably look at that and say, oh, this situation with a 16-year-old, I think this is illegal. I think this is abuse. I have to report this. I might be harboring an abuser in my ward. I gotta call CPS right now. And if you did, you would be also informed, well, there's call it a Romeo and Juliet law that says 16 and 17-year-olds may have a sexual relationship with someone up to 7 years older than them, as long as it's consensual. So
be in certain states.
In that's the law in Utah. The law varies state by state, and some states don't have this Romeo and Juliet law, but most of them do, because otherwise you get the 17-year-old girlfriend, 18-year-old boyfriend problem, right? And then all of a sudden, this 18-year-old has been called a child abuser just because he had his birthday last week, right? So if you're the bishop in these two situations, your assumption of the second scenario, the 16-year-old and the 22-year-old, that's abuse, you would be wrong according to the laws that are on in the state of Utah. That is legal. As it turns out, the law also says no one may have sexual contact with a 13-year-old, including another 13-year-old. So to not report that one, are you harboring a sexual predator? You're harboring someone who has broken the law in terms of sexual contact with 13-year-olds. So that's why we need a helpline.
Yes.
The people who say, like, just pick up and call the police. Like, well, sure, of course a bishop can do that. But I don't think most people would have known, oh, wait a minute. one of these situations is bad, and I misjudged which one.
Yeah. Yeah, that can be very confusing. I mean, nobody knows the legalities, and it varies state to state. I think here in Arizona, it's different, but my wife works for a criminal defense firm, and I think it's different here. I think there is more. I don't know if a Romeo and Juliet applies here so much, but still, I mean, the critics of the church hound that, right? It's like the that what. Do you recall how that article, or at that time, how that was treated with the calling system?
Yeah. So
because I hear this still constantly with the whole hotline.
Yeah.
And that this is a negative, get rid of it even. By some people have said this.
Here's what happened in that article. The reporter who wrote it, who is a very good reporter, has an incredible reputation on writing about very difficult issues. I actually like him quite a bit, but he did not have enough information about this Arizona case to make the claims that he wanted to make about the helpline. And so what he did was he got information about a completely unrelated case out of West Virginia that involves the church and it involves the helpline. It's from a slightly different era. Things were handled a little bit differently there. I can talk you through the case if you want. But he took what happened with the helpline in that case and applied it to what happened in Arizona as speculation. And I've read that article plenty times. And if you read it very carefully, he is using speculative words in the most forceful way that is possible. Like, it's a very good persuasive article. He is making a point. However, the David Snell from Saints Unscripted says he put frog DNA in it, right? He had to get the DNA from another case and smooshed it into this Arizona case to make the point that he wanted to make. Here's the thing with that Arizona case. The claim the article makes is there's two bishops involved. The first bishop learns that sexual abuse is happening. He calls up the helpline. The helpline tells him, oh no, you have to hide this. You can't do anything. And that the bishop sits at home on his hands, knowing perfectly well that these kids are being abused, and he does nothing. That's essentially the narrative in that article. However, that was written before the court case played out. You can go online and find these court documents. They're also there's snippets in them in my slides that I think you're going to make available with this presentation that says the bishops found out about the abuse the exact same way that you and I did, in the newspaper. They didn't know what you think that they know. Now, the first bishop knew because he was in the meeting and he informed the second bishop. He knew of a one-time incident that had happened in the past. Everybody's mind right here goes to, isn't one time enough? Shouldn't he have called and reported even one time? Two caveats. First, we don't know what that one-time incident was. He has never said, the other bishop has never said. They have stayed completely true to their responsibility to hold a confession in confidence. No one knows. I assume the attorneys know. Nobody outside of that very tight inner circle knows what was said in that confession. You can find all kinds of theories online. One of the things this man's wife says is he confessed to having sex with his mother. Like, okay, I literally have is that true? Is that not true? I have no idea and probably never will know. So before people's minds run to, well, one incident of abuse with his children was enough, you don't know what was reported, and neither do I. The second piece is the bishop did call the helpline at that point, was told, your very best bet here is to get that guy or his wife to make some bigger kind of confession. And the bishop tries and tries and tries and tries and tries, and they won't, right? He becomes completely tight-lipped and says nothing else. And in fact, from that point on, that guy barely ever even comes in the door of the church. So the bishop was trying to get more out of him, and complete stonewall. It doesn't go anywhere. So eventually they disfellowship this guy. The reasons for that are also unknown. If your mind jumps to, well, clearly they disfellowshipped him because they had learned about the extent of the abuse, that is not the case. It does not appear to be the case, at least according to the sworn declarations of these two bishops in front of the court that says, I didn't know. So
Yeah.
the AP framed this story with a very powerful frame that didn't pan out.
Yeah. Lastly, I want to address the idea of bishops' interviews with youth.
Yeah.
This was a big hoopla about this a few years back with Sam Young, who wanted to change some policies along with some very severe criticism of the brethren. Yeah. There were some changes that were made. But what are your thoughts about that? I mean, that is a difficult situation where you're trying to be, you want to look at a bishop that might be able to speak to a youth in a way that a parent may not be able to. There might be something that comes out from the youth that they would not divulge with their parents. And yet, you've got perhaps a position, a male in a position of authority. You have maybe a young woman. What's appropriate, what's not? What are your thoughts about all that?
Yeah. So the very long version of that, people should look up my 2020 talk at the Fair Conference. You can find it on YouTube. And I address that question in depth for 45 minutes. Here's my much shorter answer, which is, two things. One, changes have been made. Any young person, any adult can bring anybody they want to into their interview with the bishop. A young man or a young woman, or a grown man or grown woman, can bring their parent, their spouse, their friend, their young woman's leader, anyone they want into that interview. It is not required to be completely in private unless that kid wants it to be. And there are parents who, as a regular course of action, attend those interviews. And there are ones that say, I'm going to leave it up to my kid. If they want me in there, great. If they don't, great. Totally up to their comfort level. So I think that was a very, very, very good change that happened. Second, Sam Young's assertion is that asking a teenager the question, do you obey the law of chastity, that is in and of itself sexual abuse. That's his claim. To which I,
and many, by the way, many even LDS therapists have brought that up.
Absolutely. That is not abuse. Let me give a caveat to that. I know abuse has happened by bishops. Sam Young's website has many, many, many stories on there of people who have been abused by people in authority in the church. To prep for my 2020 talk, I read every single one of them. Right. And they're sad and devastating. And I know that happens. I'm not denying that happens by any means. However, here's the situation that we're in. Our church has high expectations for teenagers that are not reinforced by our society. Even here in Utah, a kid's going to public high school, you're gonna have plenty of friends who are absolutely uninterested in living the law of chastity. And yet this is what our church is asking him or her to do. It would be absolutely cruel to put this expectation on a kid's shoulders and then give them no support, no accountability for it whatsoever. The fact that a teenager gets a moment with a bishop every once in a while where that question gets to come up, they are getting the pastoral care from the highest leader in their congregation because they deserve it. That is support, that is accountability, that is telling this kid, hey, look, we know we are asking a lot of you to do this. Do we need to talk about it? In other churches, Protestant churches specifically, the leaders of their youth groups are absolutely talking to those kids about, they wouldn't call it the law of chastity, but they would talk to them about like what are your sexual boundaries? One of the biggest differences is that happens mostly outside of the awareness of the parents. If you're a parent of a teenager, you already know that the bishop is going to ask your kid, are you obeying the law of chastity? And in fact, in many places, parents are instructed by their bishop, would you please make sure your child knows what I'm asking with this question so that I don't have to explain it to them, right? Like, parents know this is coming. They probably know when that interview is scheduled. They're 100% aware the bishop is going to ask this. And that doesn't happen other places. It's a little side conversation with an adult that parents are never looped in on. They just aren't. And they certainly aren't given, here's the questions your kid is going to be asked, please prepare them. They're not given that in advance by any means. So for Sam Young to say that's abuse, he absolutely is misunderstanding the nature of what teenagers need. If you're going to put a big expectation on them, you better put big support on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, really appreciate your time. You're giving us a pathway to the signal among the noise here with all of this talk about abuse within the church. It's obviously it happens, as you said. I think that's important to understand. We need to be aware of those things, but we also want truth. We also want the right context and understand that there is always going to be opposition against the church. And you've got to take some of those statements with a grain of salt. And your research is phenomenal. It's great here. It really clarifies quite a bit. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.